Hello, in this video we are going to talk about the People's Republic of China and North Korea in the Cold War as well as in the post-Cold War period. We will generally talk about their ideologies as well as the development of nationalism in these countries. So, in general, of course, looking at the People's Republic of China or the China's mainland, we can see this total transformation in the 20th century. In the beginning of the 20th century, China was under quite a colonial control, and it was at the brink of the end of its dynasty. But if we look at the beginning of 21st century, almost 110 years later, China has become the second largest economy in the world, and it could be even considered right now as a superpower. So how this transformation in the second half of 20th century happened will be our main analysis. As well, also we will talk about the post-Cold War period and how China has transformed into a market economy, especially in the 1980s and onwards. Not just China, of course, we should also talk about another country within the socialist camp, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And of course this country is quite peculiar and also quite sui generis in many respects. We will talk about the development of ideology and nationalism in this country in summary as well. So we will begin by analyzing, of course, again as usual, the international history of China and its relationship with its domestic policies. We will begin with the Sino Soviet alliance, or the relationship between the USSR and People's Republic of China, and how that alliance was rising, beginning with the 1950s, but at the end of 50s, especially starting with the 60s, we can see there was a major split between these two countries. On the other hand, of course, we should also talk about the Third World relations with regard to PRC and how this kind of an international isolation and it's quite a resistance towards an ally movement later turned into the opening of relationship with the United States of America at the end of course, at the beginning of 1970s and later with the death of Mao, we can see a new era of modernizations began in China. That's why we will talk about the Deng administrations and the Four Modernizations project. But all these economic reforms didn't bring any kind of substantial political reforms in the PRC, especially as we have seen in the Tiananmen Square protests and demonstrations. This rise to the global prominence didn't result into the political transformations, or at least a kind of a wave of democratization in China yet. And that's fair, of course. North Korea is still keeping their old orthodox Marxist understanding of state decision-making processes, and in that sense we will try to give it quite a short and concise look at this country as well. So if we look at the post-war situation in China in general, as we can see, this emergence of China-USSR alliance was the end result of the Cold War paradigm, of course. These two countries were trying to, of course, hold on to each other because of their, of course, common ideology, but also in terms of their strategic interest against the United States of America. Especially after the death of Stalin, some people say that actually the split between the USSR and China began with Stalin's death, but we are seeing that actually some other events actually led to this clear-cut split between these two countries, and it was related with the, of course, the idea of supremacy of the USSR over China, and China's, of course, quite a strict understanding of independence and its attempt to at least show its sovereignty. So, in the beginning of this alliance, of course, the Soviet advisors and technicians and arms were floating towards the PRC, but with the developments of de-Stalinization in the USSR and with Khrushchev's idea of a kind of a peaceful coexistence with the capitalist countries was not aligned with Mao's understanding of a much more orthodox way of revolutionary perspective. That's why China's reaction to the Soviet sense of supremacy began to align with this idea of seeing them as kind of a revisionist communism. So by China, by the Maoist regime, this Khrushchev's idea of de-Stalinization and a kind of a peaceful coexistence with the West was a symbol of this revisionist paradigm and revisionist understanding. So with regard to, of course, showing themselves as one of these ideal types of socialist reform, China engaged in a kind of a great leap forward endeavor. But this endeavor and this kind of a collectivization of all productions, especially using the rural population for massive infrastructure projects, led to a lot of tragedies and actually the deaths and starvation of millions, tens of millions of people in mainland China. Along with all these problems, of course, China was also beginning to be isolated from the international sphere with the crisis in Taiwan Strait crisis. As you remember, Taiwan was not recognized as an independent entity by the People's Republic of China, and in that sense, China was also isolated from the international sphere because the Republic of China, also known as Taiwan, was recognized as the legitimate, in a way, inheritor of this old republic. And in these situations, of course, the isolation was even escalated with the unfulfilled promises of Soviets regarding prototype atomic bomb, because they were seeing China as an unreliable partner. So with the Lausanne meeting in 1959, when China was trying to assess the outcomes of Great Leap Forward, we can see the final and maybe the most drastic split between the two countries, because during that time USSR decided to withdraw their advisors from China, but also the great failures were enunciated by some of the Chinese administrators, and all these people were of course accused of being the supporter of Soviets, and they were in a way influenced by these revisionist ideas in the USSR, according to Mao and those people who were close to him. And also Mao was quite reactive to the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis. They thought the USSR was not assertive enough at the end of this crisis, and especially the signing of the Limited Test Ban Treaty would be, of course, hampering their own nuclear development. So in that sense, they were of course quite furious with the signing of this international agreement. So in these circumstances, of course, there was always a desire for the China to become a kind of a leader, a symbolic leader for the third world, because all these non-aligned movements, kind of a mild and kind of a revisionist kind of ideas of being not being a part of any kind of alliance, was of course not ringing any bells in China. They were not quite happy about it. That's why they were actually espousing a kind of a revolutionary diplomacy. That's why they were inflaming US intervention in Vietnam as well, by giving their support to North Vietnamese Viet Cong movement as well. So although, of course, these rhetoric, they did not usually align with their capacity to act, because they were not, of course, in terms of their economic development as well as, of course, technological stance, they were not, of course, that successful. Especially, even though they, for example, they managed to develop their first atomic bomb in 1964, they were not able to deploy it in far distance because they didn't have any kind of an adequate delivery system. So all these problems, of course, were exacerbated. They were increased with some domestic issues as well, especially those much more orthodox views, which were symbolized by the Gang of Four, those harsh and in a way hawkish ideas were especially increased with the introduction of the Cultural Revolution. And this Cultural Revolution was actually was against this idea of the party gaining control, getting an upper hand in the administration of the country. So that's why Mao was trying to balance it in that sense. So with this Cultural Revolution, of course, was literally destroying the cultural heritage of the country as well. In a way, they were trying to purge those capitalist or bourgeois ideas from the culture of China, which actually was literally destroying their traditional culture as well. Also coupled with the retreat from the active diplomacy. And this in some ways actually eased the US concerns, but also was getting China to become isolated in the international sphere. So when they had Sino Soviet border clashes in this period, China realized that these domestic problems as well as these international problems had to be ended so that they could get rid of this isolation in the international arena. That's why there was a kind of a rapprochement, and already Nixon administration in the United States of America was thinking of using this kind of a rapprochement. So it was quite mutually beneficial for both countries, because Nixon wanted to ease the tension in Asia, because the United States was not becoming successful anytime in Vietnam. So he was preparing for kind of a retreat from Vietnam, but also he was thinking of using it as a kind of a leverage in the USSR. So the kind of a ping-pong diplomacy began, because it's the visits of, for example, mutual visits of ping-pong players between two countries. As you know, Chinese are quite good at this sport. So it began with first Kissinger's visit, later with Nixon's China visit. Slowly but surely, of course, China began to be embraced, not instantaneously, but in time, began to be recognized as, of course, legitimate ruler of the mainland China. So later, of course, China gained their former permanent membership in the UN Security Council as well. But after the Watergate scandal, when Nixon had to resign, this rapprochement cannot be sustained, but still this provided a kind of a legitimacy in the international arena for PRC. But later, Mao's death brought the end of this hawkish rule and much more moderate views within the People's Republic of China. So when Deng managed to capture the power, this new era of full modernizations began. But of course, it was a paradoxical period as well, because, for example, in Cambodia, against the Vietnam regime, they were supporting Khmer Rouge, who were actually conducting little genocide. And they even had limited war with Vietnam, so they were trying to assert their position in the region, but without any clear success. So then governments usually try to achieve these 4 stages of modernizations in agriculture, in industry, science, and national defense. So it was opening to the market economies even more. And with the end of 99-year lease, they managed to have a kind of an agreement with the United Kingdom, so that they could have a kind of a 2 systems. So there would be a kind of an autonomous city administration in Hong Kong at the end of this lease, which would end, I think, in 1997. So in terms of their international situation and in terms of domestic situation, the Deng period was, of course, was a period of increasing success. But in Tiananmen, of course, square protests brought down this idea of being kind of a independent and country, although throughout the 1980s there were a lot of progress in terms of economy. This did not coincide with, of course, political modernizations. In 1989, in Beijing, students protested, as you can see in the video. One guy was stopping all these vehicles from of course, stopping the protests, but actually later he had to leave, and later, of course, all these students were either arrested or some of them were even killed. So it was a conflictual and paradoxical position in that sense, when the economy was, of course, booming in a lot of countries in this region and throughout the world. You usually see, of course, the political modernization as well. But in the case of China, this couldn't be realized, and the Chinese Communist Party managed to stay in power up until right now. So this was coupled with, of course, China's membership with World Trade Organization. Its average 10% growth each year, as you can see, between 1993 to 2012. It was a massive economic success, but it was also coupled with many privatization endeavors. So this was in some ways kind of a betrayal of Mao's heritage in some ways. This was, of course, the end result of the rise of nationalism in China as well. From 2012, we can see much more assertive international stance by China, and that's why this was triggering a kind of a trade war with the United States, especially during the Trump regime, the Trump administrations. So similar to that, of course, North Korea, in some ways simple, in some ways quite a complex country, and it's usually designated, of course, as North Korea, but its official name is the People's Republic of Korea, and it was ruled by Kim family for almost 70 years or so. The first ruler, of course, Kim Il-sung, achieved the power just after the Second World War, and his sole purpose, even beginning with, and he was one of the guerrillas fighting against the Japanese forces. He was trying to unify the country under the communist rule. So this desire to maintain a kind of an independent policy, especially not just against, of course, the capitalist countries, but also vis-a-vis USSR and PRC, was the main idea behind the existence of North Korea. Also, it was trying to achieve a kind of autarkic, kind of a self-sustaining economic policy, the idea of a Jewish self-reliance accordingly. And that's why they were engaging in a kind of a similar to Great Leap Forward Cholima movement, which was also similarly not successful in North Korea as well. So while they were trying to achieve economic growth, they were also, of course, trying to assert their military dominance as well. But all these policies, like three fronts policy, these equal emphasis policies, in many ways lagged behind the South Korean economy, because especially starting with the 1970s and onwards, export-oriented economy of South Korea and its international connections, of course, brought it even further than the North Korean economy. So the 1970s and 80s onwards, it was in some ways kind of a shift towards importing Western factories and machinery, while also, of course, due to their foreign debts, they had to default. They declared that they will not be able to pay back their foreign debts. So it was a full of crisis, political and economic, at the end of the Cold War for North Korea, because of their fragile position. With the end of the USSR, of course, they lost a huge economic support from the Soviets. So they had to buy their oil needs from the market prices, which was, of course, hampering their economic development. But also in 1993, they decided to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, because they were trying to signal that they could develop become a kind of a nuclear power. So although there was a temporary solution of 1994 agreement, they promised if they are provided with enough resources, they wouldn't engage in a kind of a development of nuclear capacity. But in the beginning of 21st century, in 2003, they began to develop nuclear capacity again, and they managed to become a nuclear power in 2006. So this was, of course, during at the end of 20th century. Actually, there was that hope with the Sunshine Policy. There was hope that maybe this North Korean and South Korean negotiations would flourish, and later, maybe during the regime of Kim Jong-il, the son of Kim Il-sung, this peace treaty would be finally established, as you know, because although they are technically not inactive in practice, they are not in war, but the 1953 armistice actually didn't end the war altogether. And even DPRK no longer recognizes this armistice. So technically, in some ways, they've been thinking of continuing that war. But in terms of their military and economic capacity, they are in no way could be successful in that sense. That's why they are using these asymmetrical forces of getting a nuclear bomb and using as a kind of a leverage against the West to continue the existence of their country. Although there was an attempt by the Trump administration, if you remember, a kind of a reopening of peace negotiations. But at the end, of course, it miserably failed, and no longer there is no viable way of conducting peace negotiations as of now. So in general, what do we see? Of course, China had a major impact in the Cold War balance, especially between the United States and the USSR. It was representing kind of a third way of not just political development, but also economic development. Despite its, of course, failures, it was still, and in many ways, it was successful during the Cold War. And in the aftermath of the Cold War, of course, it began to be one of the key symbols of a communist country with a market economy. So in what ways we can call it a communist country? It's of course open to debate. It usually had two main foreign policy goals in that way. It always had to assert, of course, its full independence and try to unify all its former lands under one umbrella of People's Republic of China. But of course, this resulted in a paradoxical relationship with other countries. It was in one way trying to gain international acceptance, but also all these independence and unification rhetoric was resulting in the isolation of PRC in international and diplomatic negotiations. And DPRK was even in a much more bigger isolation right now in terms of its, of course, totalitarian nature because of its political problems, but also because of its economic bankruptcy. It's in a much more worse situation, of course, compared to the Chinese economy. We cannot even compare. And if you look at the image on the left, you can see there is a gap between, for example, between China and South Korea, which is North Korea. So even in terms of providing electricity to its citizens, it's kind of a failed state in many ways. Although it's usually in the news about its dominance in the region, etc. But in actual reality, it's far from it. So China and North Korea are two key players and key actors, actually, despite all these shortcomings. And especially, of course, the People's Republic of China will surely will be maybe the biggest economy in the upcoming decades in the world, and probably will begin to shape the international relations even further. Thank you for watching.